All right, we're about 5 minutes past the start time. I'll continue to let people in as I see them join. I wanted to welcome everybody, all of our MVJ members to the Disabled Narrative Series, the first in the series. I am Noelle Weehee. I am the Member Programs Manager with Military Veterans in Journalism. And today we bring you the first in our disability narrative webinars as part of our initiative designed to empower journalists, storytellers, and advocates with the tools to create accurate, inclusive, and impactful narratives about disability. For our first event in this series, we are proud to collaborate with the Disabled American Veterans, an organization dedicated to a single purpose of empowering veterans to lead high-quality lives with respect and dignity. From DAV, we have with us and welcome Dan Clare, an Air Force and Marine Corps veteran. An accomplishment of his worth mentioning that is close to MVJ's heart is that he was named the Air National Guard Print Journalist of the Year for 2007. Dan has been with DAV in a professional capacity since 2004 and now serves as the Chief Communications and Outreach Officer. We welcome Dan here today to share with us some expertise on the topic of covering veterans with disabilities. And thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Dan Clare, Marine veteran of the Persian Gulf era, Air Force veteran of the Iraq War, and as she mentioned, Chief Communications and Outreach Officer for the charity Disabled American Veterans, or DAV, as we're more commonly known. Combined annual spending for the Defense Department and Department of Veterans Affairs accounts for the largest share of our national budget. We spend $1.2 trillion annually on both. But like many things neglected through the new and changing media landscape, this spending and the issues surrounding it receive disproportionately less attention or scrutiny than they deserve from our media. So I want to thank you on behalf of DAV for taking the time to participate in the presentation. And I want to thank our friends at Military Veterans in Journalism, MVJ, and their generous sponsors for putting this series together and the effort to get it right when it comes to the disability narrative. Let's see, did I skips? All right. Okay, where are we at? Okay, disabled veterans, of course, are part of the larger community of people with disabilities, but they're unique in many ways. At DAV, we talk about keeping the promise to veterans, and there is a promise that makes this subset of the disabled population a little bit different, a little bit unique. That promise, it's really a social contract. It states that when an individual puts our nation's uniform on, he or she will be, to the best of our abilities as a country, made whole if their health and ability to sustain themselves is negatively impacted as a result of their service. That means, in a sense, that we, from our government to our fellow citizens, have a unique civic responsibility to our defenders. It's a very basic idea, but it's worth looking closer to frame the conversation about responsibly covering disabled veterans. How many of you are familiar with the blank check theory? It states that to answer the call to serve in the military, an individual writes a blank check up to and including their very life. It is increasingly difficult to find Americans who are healthy enough, mentally and physically, and meet the standards required to serve in uniform. The proliferation of medications that eliminate eligibility, the physical fitness of our young, the economic environment, and the plethora of opportunities make it difficult for military recruiters. The military has, at times, been considered the last refuge of people who couldn't get into college or get a job. It was once an alternative, in fact, to incarceration. Today, it's very different. It's harder than ever to find people who can even qualify to serve. Where it relates to the idea of the theory of blank checks, I prefer actually a rental car theory. That is, when you rent a car, if you don't buy the rip-off insurance the company provides, you're asked to go around and mark every ding and dent. That's because once you sign off, you're responsible for any damage beyond that. Insurance processing for the U.S. military is similar in a lot of ways to the way we walk around that car when we rent it, whatever your equivalent is of that. At MEPS, we're poked, we're prodded, we're inspected to make sure the government is getting what it paid for. When they turn us back into society, the wear, tear, and damage that came with our years in service needs to be accounted for. That's the promise we make to veterans. We don't owe them a new house and car or a trip to Disney World. After they serve honorably, we owe them the opportunity to be able to care for themselves and their families. Based on the level of disabilities they face after service, we owe it to them to make up the difference if they have injuries or aggravations to pre-existing conditions. Keeps wanting to jump ahead on me. All right. When we talk about the promise, we should consider our history. Ours is a nation born through war. In our revolution, 6,800 Americans were killed and around 6,100 were wounded. Another 17,000 died from disease. Remember that figure, 6,800 killed, 6,100 wounded. That's interesting in comparison to modern combat, where each generation seems to achieve a higher survival rate. That can be attributed to advances in battlefield armor and medicine, the ability to quickly get troops into full spectrum trauma hospitals, and other advances. We had 4,419 military fatalities in Iraq and 2,354 in Afghanistan. So in comparison, the dead outnumbering the wounded by 111% in our revolution, and that's around 87% of our wounded surviving our most recent war, though many are suffering catastrophic and life-changing injuries. As a great military commander, George Washington once really had the utmost concern for the troops he'd led and fought alongside. After the revolution, he made a very important point. His words are proudly enshrined on the memorial that we have in Washington, D.C. for disabled veterans. He said, "The willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by our nation." In 2022, the Army, Air Force, and Navy missed their recruiting goals by around 25% each. Currently, recruiting is up, which is good. Some attribute that to the change in administration. I'm not sure those numbers are based on December figures, and the military recruiting pipeline is ongoing. But just to put that into perspective, we need 60,000 or so people to join the Army alone every year just to maintain our largest branch. Replenishing those ranks is very difficult. The military retirement system changed in 2016 from a purely defined benefit system to a blended system. Think of it like a 401k with a bit more if they stick around long enough. Instead of a straight pension, people enlist today have a very different deal than those who came before. That's a lot more like the transition civilian employers have adopted over the years. It's not, however, the ironclad guarantee that past generations enjoyed after serving their 20 or more years in uniform. For many who do not re-enlist, it may be a positive, but this also shows that the deal folks have with the government can change. The GI Bill, home loan guarantees, and enlistment bonuses are incentives to join the military. They're codified by law. Disability benefits and health care for service-connected disabled veterans are part of a promise that isn't fully written down, but it's felt in the hearts and minds of most Americans. We need soldiers, airmen, sailors, Marines, coasties, and whatever you call Space Force people on a constant basis. If their grandparents or parents aren't receiving care after being poisoned overseas or paralyzed in a training accident, what are the odds that they're willing to risk their lives for an ungrateful nation? It's important to note, while we talk about defending our nation and our way of life, that the influence of our military, the largest in the world, what that projects on the world stage contributes to what we colloquially call our national prosperity. There's a good reason why we are willing often to intervene through military operations and meet regions where mineral rights or oil or international shipping lanes contribute to our economy. Beyond defending our rights and liberty, we use our military to protect what is often termed our national interests. That goes back to our revolution, where a bunch of old white guys decided they didn't want to pay taxes to jolly old England. In terms of military spending, in 2021, the United States spent $778 billion on our national defense. That's twice as much as our closest competitor, China. And it's more than the next 9 highest spending military nations combined. By population, at more than 334 million people, the U.S. is the 3rd largest nation on the planet. Yet in spite of the budget we give our military, relatively few people are touched by military service. In terms of people serving on active duty, we have roughly the third largest military force in terms of active duty personnel. By the way, these are DoD images that you see on the slide. If you wonder why the resolution on the image on the right is lower, you can ask the Defense Department. That was one of those stories that was about our first female Black tactical air pilot. She received to receive her wings of gold. It looks like it was pulled down recently for some reason. So was an image of the Enola Gay. I guess they were both canceled in the culture wars or through the latest anti-woke algorithms. I'll let you decide. Let's see. All right. Let's go back. It's been this way for a long time, though, when you talk about how we use our military. It was happening before DAV was founded in 1920 by World War I veterans. If you have any doubt, I encourage you to look into the work of a legendary Marine named Smedley Butler. In a 1935 speech and booklet, he said of war, "It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is concluded for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes." He was sadly speaking from experience. Smedley Butler was a disabled veteran. He was wounded in combat rescuing a fellow Marine, and he was actually promoted to brevet captain at the age of 18 for his courage in saving that fellow Marine. He received the Medal of Honor twice for valor, and here was his take on the deeper truth behind combat operations in which he'd been involved. Quote, "I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped the raping of a half dozen Central American republics for the benefits of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested." Interestingly, this book came out after Butler had been approached by two veterans with the American Legion who happened to be plotting to overthrow the United States government with funds he later found out that came from leading captains of industry at the time. These people were concerned about socialist policies and economic direction under FDR. That's called the business plot. Look it up. That's not just me throwing shade at our friends in the American Legion. And for the record, I didn't bring up Legionnaire's disease, but you can Google that too to learn more. People in the veterans service community, we kind of tease each other similarly to how we do in the military. So I'm a proud member of the Legion. I'm just trying to bring a little levity to the conversation. It is a sad truth that veterans have frequently been used as a bargaining chip for politicians and pawns for those in power. But when the wars are over and those who fought in them are no longer vital to the interests of the powerful or drain on the budget, the commitment to keeping the promise becomes much more of a battle. As the needs of veterans grow over time, the desire of the public has long been to turn our attention to less depressing issues. We have never fully connected the costs of veterans to the cost of war. We just don't plan that way. We're often eager to send people into harm's way, but we're more reluctant to foot the bills that come years after the final parade. And that's especially relevant now, but it's a topic too that we'll talk about more in my next presentation. Skipping ahead again. My intention here, I'm not trying to make people who join the military sound like mercenaries. That's not why people enlist. It's not why they sacrifice. They do that for their brothers and sisters. They do it for noble reasons. Often, the point is that those who shoulder the burden of our national defense are likely the least to benefit financially after being changed in service. Now, let's get down to some basics. What or who is a disabled veteran? Or a veteran with disabilities, if you prefer. People used to think of veterans as the traditional boy next door. He was often blonde with blue eyes, and answered the bugle call to war. Disabled veterans, in all actuality, were a pretty diverse set. We're mothers, we're fathers, we're titans of industry, we're public servants. We don't ask to be glorified because we have a disability. I think veterans want to be treated respectfully for what they've overcome to be contributors to society. They prefer their contributions, not their limitations, to be the prism through which they're recognized. In short, they don't want to be defined by their disabilities, but they're proud of the sacrifices they've made and the value they bring to their communities. They don't want to be typecast or portrayed as whiners, certainly. They join the military to be a part of something larger than themselves, and most are justifiably proud to make that a part of their identity, but it's not all they are. They want justice for themselves and their fellow veterans, and by and large, they want to make sure promises are kept and veterans are not forgotten. DAV has been in many respects ahead of the curve when it comes to the needs of women veterans. We were part of the first national summit. We actually helped put it on with the VA that recognized there were unique and unmet needs facing women veterans, but that curve has been far outpaced by needs. Women are the fastest growing segment of the veteran population. They represent 11% of our community now. They're going to rise to 18%, almost 1 in 5 by 2046. There are about 2 million veterans alive today, women veterans alive today. We have to recognize the obvious fact that women have different healthcare needs than their male counterparts. That's not DEI, which is so maligned as of late. It's just common sense. So too is looking at specific outcomes that seem to disproportionately affect minority veterans and treatment disparities. Black veterans using the VA are more likely to die of breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and HIV than white patients at the VA. Hispanic veterans also more likely to die of colorectal cancer and HIV. Women veterans deserve a VA that isn't unwelcoming or threatening. And the male veterans of all races, all nationalities deserve, they deserve to have the same outcomes that their fellow veterans enjoy. This is just evidence-based stuff, and evidence is increasingly important. Research is important. The VA, we're talking about a $350 billion a year department. We are more efficient when we have people conducting research and analyzing and holding that part of our government accountable. The veterans population overall is declining. How many of you have heard that less than 1% of our population has served in the military? That's really not quite true. However, we have 1.3 million serving on active duty, 2.1 million when you count the reserve components. It is accurate to say that at any given time, our national defense is shouldered by less than 1% of our population. Proportionally, based on how we spend on and use our military, the number of people who currently serve and have served is a remarkably low part of our population. About 7% of the adult population served in the military, and there are around 19 million veterans nationwide, and we create more every day. From 2000 to 2018, the number of living U.S. veterans declined by about a third. The VA projects the number of veterans will continue to decline over the next 20 plus years. We had a massive influx of veterans coming out of the Vietnam War, many of whom were conscripted. By age alone, the healthcare needs of the veterans community are incredibly diverse. By 2046, we'll be down to about 12.5 million veterans unless something drastic changes. So by the time some of you are ready to retire as a voting bloc, we can count on our fellow veterans have even less sway at the polls than we do now. Unfortunately for us, as the Vietnam era veterans show us with Agent Orange exposure, the needs of the population tend to grow over time. As the population evolves in demographics, a strong relationship between the American people and their veterans becomes incredibly vital. No matter how you slice it, the burden of military service is shouldered by an increasingly small percentage of the population. Understanding that community and getting our stories right becomes that much more important for responsible journalists, for responsible people to talk about disability issues impacting veterans. Early next month, I'm going to be going to Aspen, Colorado to attend the National Disabled Veterans Winter Sports Clinic. It's the largest adaptive event of its kind. About 400 veterans are going to be there. And that's where I met this guy. This is Dan O'Connor. Some of the folks wounded in war who are going to be at the clinic, they were hurt serving in war. Some of them were hurt in traffic accidents after service or in other ways. Some veterans, not all, go at least a little out of their way to let people know their visible injuries were incurred in our national defense if that's their situation. It can't be that can be subtle. It can be, seeing a parachutist badge on a prosthetic, or an army sticker on a wheelchair. That could be even more overt, wearing that grunt style t-shirt with the "Scars Are Sexy" iron on her patch. People express themselves in different ways. Those give you some clues as to how comfortable they might be talking about their service. But when it comes to the media, veterans are frequently uncomfortable with interviews, with that interaction. And I know that's a stereotype, but it's borne out by 20 years of work with that population. I think just, and this is just kind of putting an idea behind it. For a lot of people, I know it started in uniform, with veterans being concerned that the media has a political bias or that they're anti-military in some way. That harkens all the way back to Vietnam, or that a reporter might compromise a military operation in a way that helps the enemy. We've seen that, we've heard that. Or a reporter can't keep up in the field, or the fear is that the reporter is going to do something stupid and get people hurt, or that you're going to say something to the media and you're going to get quoted and it's going to get you in trouble somehow. It's compounded in many cases when a veteran has been misquoted or the facts of their life story were misrepresented. Veterans are extremely sensitive about it, and Dan is no exception to that. He's a Marine veteran of the Vietnam War. He's also a grandfather, father, and husband. So he has a lot more going on in his identity than just being a disabled veteran. He's an adaptive sports coach. He's trained Paralympic athletes. He's an all-around great American. And sometimes, occasionally, he wears plaid skirts. And that's a joke that I might tell to Dan if I wasn't afraid of him punching me in the mouth. But it'd be easier to get away with that than another mistake that I've seen made with Dan. Dan was severely wounded in combat. He nearly lost his leg in Vietnam. Then after his military service was over, he was in a motorcycle accident and he lost the leg that had been injured. So a reporter who, without any ill intention, isn't clear in their reporting that Dan did not lose his leg in combat, even if he almost did, is going to be on his fighting side. He would consider that stolen valor. So reporters, we're trained, or reporters are people in communications, people involved in the narrative. We're trained not to make suppositions in the course of our work. But for veterans who consider their service or injuries part of their identity, and some do, or for the larger community they know they represent, even a little mistake that could cause someone to question their integrity or hurt public opinion for every other person who served, that's a mortal sin to veterans. That's something we all take very seriously. Disabilities run the gamut. The most common disability probably is it actually is hearing loss. And that makes sense when you consider the way veterans work around flight lines, they work with generators, weapons, and of course, everyone's career starts with a loud drill instructor, drill sergeant, trainer, whoever is screaming in your face. Hearing loss is a disability that, some people don't take it very seriously, but it's a pretty sneaky problem, and it can have major implications on someone's health, their ability to work and interact socially with other people. If you can't hear your boss, sometimes there's a tendency to nod as if you are. For people with hearing loss, that's a common coping mechanism, but that can cost you in your career. So all disabilities should be taken pretty seriously. And of course, you can't see every injury. People always think of PTSD and traumatic brain injuries typically as the major invisible injuries. Around 7% of the veteran population experiences PTSD, and that's a significant number of people. And it's disabling at various levels, but you have to also consider that non-veteran PTSD rates are actually pretty high too, at just 6%. We tell employers sometimes that the leading causes of PTSD in America are car accidents and TBIs. You'd never dream of not hiring someone because they were in an auto accident, but employers are significantly less likely to hire a veteran with PTSD. Even sharing information about PTSD through a veteran's social networks can make it less likely that they will get an interview with a prospective employer. So it's important how we treat that. Some instances of PTSD and TBI come from combat. They were common injuries, common things to leave Iraq and Afghanistan with. Some come by training, but invisible injuries can happen in a variety of ways. And we can't make assumptions that injuries that are not seen do not create significant challenges. You're looking right now at a couple of visuals that I brought home from Iraq. We weren't allowed to take photos of the burn pits while I was stationed there and as a public affairs person. So I took this long distance photo of a nice Humvee. There's a street light there and a chain link fence. That's at Balad Air Base. What can I say? I'm very artistic. I wasn't taking a picture of the burn pits per the regulation. But in the background, what you really see there, of course, is a plume from the 10-acre burn pit. This is one of the better days. The smoke was being blown mostly away from where thousands of soldiers and airmen were living. The 5-day forecast on the right, it looks like something you probably see on your phone. But if you look closer, the morning forecast on each of those 5 days calls for smoke and haze, which is something I've never seen on my phone. Many disabled veterans are people who had some of the cush non-combat arms jobs, maybe some people call them cush, that leave, but those things didn't leave them safe from toxins. And now we're talking about Agent Orange, the Skittles Pond at K2 in Uzbekistan, asbestos. Veterans are exposed to those things in much higher concentrations. The things that are common to the United States, they received them in much higher concentrations. In the entire time I was in Iraq, I never saw one of those California warnings saying that something we were working with caused cancer. But you could assume a lot of the stuff out there could make you sick. We have, just as a government, we've made a lot of veterans ill. We've exposed them to a lot. Some of them meet the stereotypical definition of a visibly injured veteran. Some of the people have been exposed. Some people with invisible injuries suffer from military sexual trauma. There's all different ways that you can be changed. Some of these folks, even the folks who endured MST, they're willing to talk about their service very openly. And they do that almost exclusively because it will be a service to their fellow veterans. Others do not. You can ask a veteran anything you want. Of course, you all know that. But they aren't required to share their diagnosis. They're not required to tell you their disability rating or how many people they killed in war or the other obviously insensitive and invasive questions that people and reporters sometimes think, for whatever reason, are fair to share with all of humanity. Veterans deserve to be treated with dignity. Stories that focus on their abilities and achievements are important, but to a disabled veteran who is paralyzed, when you make a big deal of the effort they made to get out of bed in the morning or in and out of their car, those transfers, and you tell them, oh, that's inspiring, that's humiliating to a veteran. There's a difference between real inspiration and inspiration porn. I know you're going to hear more about that probably as the series progresses, and I'd encourage you to avoid inspiration porn, but to look deeper at these veterans. You're often going to find some very authentic versions of truly inspiring people who don't want your pity, people who answered the call of duty, and people who are largely more resilient than the rest of the population. Veterans were among those involved in the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. Veterans have been involved in violent crimes. Veterans are incarcerated at very high rates. And there are special veterans treatment courts that recognize that some involved in crime have extenuating circumstances related to their service. Veterans, of course, make the decision to end their lives at higher rates than their civilian counterparts. We, as a community of veterans, we have a lot of problems to confront, and no one's asking the media to ignore that. But we also need to make sure that we're not painting veterans with too broad of a brush. If a veteran is involved in a violent crime, too often that individual is portrayed as a trained killer disaffected by war and eager to exact revenge on this ungrateful populace that just doesn't get it, man. Never mind if it's someone who left boot camp before they got to weapons training, or if they're barely qualified at the range the 4 times that they were required to do so in their entire military careers. Sensationalized stories and headlines that creates a perception that has negative consequences on military service. It perpetuates stereotypes. And you have to think about that. Think of the impact that has on your fellow veterans who want opportunities in newsrooms or in other jobs where they can make a real difference. We're obligated, though, to ask hard questions and tell our truths. According to the story you see on the screen there, of 195 mass shootings since 1966, 50 involve suspects who are veterans or people with military training. And that's a difficult truth for us to face. That's a difficult thing to be out there if you're a veteran who's resilient and doing good things in the world. But it kind of reminds me, it's almost as if this journalist benefited from our earlier work with MVJ, where we were sending ambassadors into newsrooms. The story, when you get into it, reads several times, but also it has this quote that's really great. To be clear, only a tiny fraction of people with military backgrounds become mass shooters, but military experience is something a disproportionate share of attackers have in common. That is a fact. That's not presented in a sensational way. The article was handled very responsibly, in fact. So you're looking at something that's increasingly rare to find in media coverage today, and that is nuance. Very, very rare. Suicide is, of course, a major concern for those of us who work with veterans. Many of you have heard the 22 a day statistic. That's changed for the better, fortunately, but it's not great. On average, about 17 veterans make the decision to end their own lives every day on average. And these aren't all combat veterans, but obviously they're people who are facing significant challenge in their lives. Veterans are more likely to make the decision to end their lives than others, than their civilian counterpart or the people who haven't served. How many of you have heard of suicide contagion? When you report on suicide, it can increase the likelihood of suicide in vulnerable people. It's just a fact. But on the flip side of that, responsible reporting can encourage change and influence public opinion. It can lead people to seek help. It can de-glorify the decision to end your life. But no one wants to have blood on their hands in their reporting. So here's some tips. First, avoid explaining details of the act explicitly. Don't go too far into that. Don't position suicide as a contagion. Reporting on suicide as an epidemic or sensationalizing it, that sky high suicide rates or rocketing suicide rates, that can increase suicide statistics because it makes it sound like it's just a common solution that everyone else is trying. For veterans who are in a dark place, that's not where we want to go. Instead of talking about veterans being successful or failing at suicide, which is another one, you can simply say died by suicide or took their own lives. The words commit suicide can be damaging, and that's just a common language choice that people use. But think about people commit crimes. We should stop talking about suicide as if we're covering a crime scene. We have a lot of vulnerable people in our community. No one wants to have death on their hands. If you're in doubt, there are actually a lot of resources available to help you responsibly discuss suicide. You can ask Google, but it's a bonus in your coverage if you take it even a step further, sharing the VA crisis line, sharing some tips, some advice from a specialist that can combat suicide is a great service to the veterans community. And it can change lives, save lives. All right. Finally, I want to take, it's important that we take the time to learn about the issues, policies, and processes that veterans are experiencing. It's hard work. The VA is a very complex and sprawling entity. But if you're contributing to the narrative surrounding veterans with disabilities and the need for quality sources, you got to do your homework. You got to just take the time. And I know you're looking at this slide. Before you start in on me, I do want to explain that the above photo does not represent Marine Corps math. Marines do, in fact, know better than to try and solve math problems by using their fingers and toes. We use crayons instead. They are delicious. Seriously, though, anyone who served in the military and is disabled is a disabled veteran. That makes sense. But typically, when we are talking about a disabled veteran, we are talking about what we call more specifically service-connected disabled veterans. Obviously, that means they were hurt or changed in military services in ways that impact their ability to work. It impacts their ability to integrate into society. When the VA is evaluating a veteran for disability compensation, they use what is called a combined ratings formula. Based on the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 38, Part 4, the schedule of disability of rating disabilities looks at what the VA calls the whole veteran. The CFR defines every relatable disability that is connected with service, assigning a percentage based on severity. So say you were in service, you lose your arm above the elbow as a result of your military service. You're going to get a lower rating if you're above your elbow than if it was below your elbow. If you lost your leg above the knee, you're rated higher than if it were below the knee. And that's because this rating schedule looks at that and they say the world is a little bit more accessible. You're more likely to be able to restore that much more of your ability. If you have those joints, you can work a prosthetic differently. Most disabled veterans have more than one disability. That's why we have polytrauma centers. That's why coordinated care through the VA is so important, because there's a lot of issues typically going on at one time. So each of these disabilities, it's given a percentage of impairment based on increments of 10. So using VA math, 50 plus 50 does not equal 100. If a veteran is rated at 100% for severe PTSD, I'm sorry, if a veteran is rated, say, at 75% for severe PTSD, and they lost some limb or something else, and they had another 75% rating, that doesn't mean they're going to get 150% compensation from the VA. What the VA does is they take the largest disability, and that becomes your primary disability there. And then every subsequent rating is measured based on the veteran's remaining ability. So they're looking at what's left and how does the next issue impair your ability. And then whenever you get a 5 in the average, they round it up by 10% increments. There's more to it than that. There are a lot of different circumstances. But understanding that if you're talking to a veteran and the veteran explains to you that they got ripped off because they had a 75% disability rating and they received 25% for a severe asthma condition or something like that, that veterans might say to you, I did not get 100%. I'm getting screwed by the VA. You have to, they're not. Look at what's there. The VA is looking at the whole person. That's the law. That's how it works. If you don't know answers on these things, you got to take the time to learn it, or just don't report on it. It's better to get it right. And DAV organizations like DAV, there's a lot of veterans out there who are involved in this process. Go to the top, get the best person that you can to explain these things, to be subject matter experts. If you're a reporter, you owe it to veterans to do that. So here we are. I know we probably have some questions that I'm happy to take. Before we do that, I want to thank MVJ again. We'll have another discussion pretty soon here about the current landscape facing veterans in terms of policy. I want to dig more into that. I want you to be more informed when you're speaking about the disability narrative where veterans are concerned. And I'm grateful for all of you who took the time to either watch this or tune in. One final thing too, if you need help with your claims for benefits, don't go it alone. DA offers every service that we provide at no cost to you, no obligation. You don't have to join DAV. All you have to do is show up and work with us. We'll walk you through that process. That's true of jobs, starting a business. We have volunteer opportunities. There's all kinds of things. You can check us out on dav.org if you want to learn more, or patriotbootcamp.org if you're an entrepreneur with a great new media company that deserves an acceleration. So I might have some questions and I'll open it up. I think Zach might have had a question. Zach?
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much, Dan. This is really enlightening. It's always good to hear from you, and thank you for your support of military veterans and journalism and its mission, and for your support of the disabled community as well as the disabled veteran community. Thank you. A quick word of thanks as well to Noel for organizing this. Really appreciate all the work that you've done, Noel. If some of you don't know, I'm Zach Badorf, co-founded Military Veterans and Journalism. I'm a former reporter and also a disabled veteran. This is just this beginning of our series. We're going to have a range of organizations speak on these topics of disability narratives, both veteran service organizations as well as organizations focused on disability that have nothing to do with veterans. There definitely is that overlap, though, and Dan, we really appreciate you providing insight into that. So with that, I want to emphasize MVJ is strictly nonpartisan. So this is not intended to get political, but we do know that the impact of politics around us has an impact on our world and our service and our ability to get treatment and the stories that are told about us. And Dan, you did mention this example of how some images as well as some stories have been removed from the Department of Defense websites, which we could have a whole session just on that. DEI is a big thing in the news these days. It's a big thing for the administration. And MVJ, again, we're strictly nonpartisan, but we are acting to diversify newsrooms. We want veteran voices. We want people with disabilities in the media. We care about diversity in America's newsrooms. We're thankful for the support of the Ford Foundation to help us focus some effort on these important issues. So I guess the question to you, Dan, and this is intended to be a conversation, so it doesn't have to be just you that answers if others in the room also have some thoughts to share. How does this conversation, this national conversation around DEI have an effect on how we tell the story around disability, and specifically thinking about disabled veterans?
That's a good question, and it's interesting. You know, we work in the employment landscape a lot. That's a big part of what we do. We do about 100 career fairs a year, and we talk to a lot of employers, and a lot of employers have been interested in talking with DAV, and that's come through a mixture of veteran resource groups, and it comes from equity and inclusion groups, DEI groups, within companies, and those are that's obviously something that is in the crosshairs right now socially in our country. And I don't think it shouldn't matter. I mean, I think that disabled veterans bring a ton to the workforce, and it shouldn't matter. But it's occurred to me that as we look at DEI going becoming this curse acronym, if you can't call it a curse word, that veterans, maybe people don't feel the obligation as much to hire veterans, which is ridiculous. But we were kind of considered part of that, especially disabled veterans. I would say though too that we're concerned, and I want to talk about this a lot more when we get into the next conversation. But we're concerned about research, about how research is being impacted at the VA, research that helps veterans. I mentioned, we're not talking about, the stereotypical woke, warm and fuzzy And I'm not trying to offend anyone when I say that. I mean, but that you have to look at things from both perspectives, and DAV is also a nonpartisan organization. But beyond the equity, beyond all of that, um, veterans need to get they need jobs. They need to be able to go to work, and we're concerned about that. When it comes to the VA, though, we're talking about research that has very specifically pointed to outcomes that are different. The treatment of veterans being different based on their minority status, or based on them being a Black veteran, or being an Hispanic veteran, or being a woman veteran. So it's a lot. It should be a lot easier to focus on that. But then you're concerned, you see the Enola Gay getting pulled down when it's probably the least woke thing in American history. The Enola Gay being removed probably through some algorithm, probably not on purpose, whatever. But you see something like that moved, and you wonder, when we're looking at research for veterans, I understand about which I, the idea that we're studying transgendered mice or something like. I mean, I don't want to get involved in the culture wars when I say that, but that's not DAV doesn't have a stance on that stuff. But we're concerned if you take if women is a key word that you're looking up when you're going through research, maybe 1,000 research grants that are going to help veterans. What impact could that have on women veterans who just, and this is something that's been hammered a lot during the campaign cycle. There are clear differences in healthcare needs for women. So we're concerned about that. We're concerned about a lot, and I'll go into that a lot more in the next conversation, but I probably answered that with more than you asked for. But thanks for the question, Zach. Do we have any other questions, or is there anything on LinkedIn maybe? Oh, John.
Hello. I just wanted to start off by thanking you so much for the presentation, and apologies if, well, one, we're going to laugh at the fact that the Canadian is the first one to ask a question, but not the only Canadian here, but one of them. Like I said, we really wanted to thank you for the presentation and some of the things that I didn't know, or makes me reflect on past reporting that I've done on military vets. As somebody who covers parasport, it's usually in that context, but so it goes. And I did want to flag one thing before I get to my question, so apologies if it comes across as more of a comment. One of the things that comes forward for me in your presentation, and really in what you're talking about here around DEI, is that story of that vet that you brought forward. I think it's from Syracuse, when we're talking about veterans and suicide. That vet was wrapped in a trans flag when they were found. So I think I bring that up to say that I think I really appreciated the way that your presentation talks about these intricacies and these connections in ways that we really it's important for us to think of moving forward. One of my I guess my question is, how do you sorry, it floated away from me for a second as I rambled a little bit. I apologize. What are some of the um, like you talked about the sort of stereotypical way that people begin stories about the military, and I'm curious what some of those are in your view, because so often in disability coverage, right, we see like, so I'll use my name as my own self as an example. John Lepke is confined to a wheelchair, and then we will get into whatever is happening with the story. I'm curious if there are sort of military specific tropes that you see that people should be aware of.
Well, I think we can look at the broader media landscape to some extent there, and you look, going back to Dirty Harry, and the shivering private that General Patton smacks in the film, and what a great service that was for our nation, or there's a lot of examples like that. I would say, suicide is something you need to be extremely sensitive about. Headlines are usually the culprit, I think, when it comes to headlines, and now with new media, your briefs, and everyone wants clicks. They all want an audience. They want people to follow along. But you have to think about what the consequences are going to be to that if you're making it sound like veterans are all a bunch of mass killers or whatever. And I think CBS was a rare example. And if you read it, you'd actually see a very concerted effort to do responsible reporting. I would say this too. Sometimes what we're seeing is people going to very divergent opinions in ways that aren't necessarily productive, that don't really represent what's going on. And you want to, you always want to look at people who are on both sides of an issue. I think that's important to do. But I was reading this Wall Street Journal article, I think it was Wall Street Journal, and they were talking about, they're talking about cuts to the VA, which I'll talk about more. Potentially 83,000 people losing their jobs, maybe 20,000 of those folks being veterans. And when they're talking about, they quoted a veteran who was kind of like, "Yeah, I don't need the VA, and they can take it and shove it. Our country's going to pot, and veterans need to take it on the chin a little bit and share in the sacrifices here." And then you wonder, well, what sacrifices are we being asked to share in? Are we being asked to share in stimulus checks for the wealthiest Americans? And I'm not trying to get partisan here. We need as a community, we need to have a responsible accountability to the taxpayers. We need to be efficient. But there's also the sense sometimes that they're finding these people who are saying things that are really damaging to the veterans community, and they present that as if, well, that's how some veterans feel, and I don't think that veteran represented even a small percentage of the population. So I don't know if that helped entirely, John. I appreciate the question. I'm sure everyone here has changed their mind on tariffs now.
No, absolutely. I mean, I appreciate the response, and thank you.
Thank you. Karen, or Karan, sorry, I mispronounced that.
That's okay. Hey, thank you so much for this. I do have a question. It's about the erasure of our service and our sacrifice, especially when it comes to underserved communities, women and minorities. We are seeing spaces disappear on federal websites. And there's just a lot of uncertainty about how veterans who have served, who are disabled, may lose benefits. We're seeing these federal agencies be slashed and then put back, and so many people are living in a constant state of anxiety right now. But what can you speak to the erasure? How can we keep our histories, our narratives, ours?
That's a great question. I feel terrible for people who are seeing that happen, and seeing sometimes things get removed where, I mean, even if you look beyond it through the DEI scope, these are just people who are great Americans who their stories deserve to be told in a lot of cases. And people feel, differently about different aspects of that. But, it's a shame that I was actually, I need to phrase this carefully, but when I was in Iraq, we were Tuskegee Airmen. That was the name of the unit. And I don't know if that unit were stood up right now, if we would carry on that name, or what would happen. I would say this, and it's very important that everyone knows this. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs, we just saw him in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. He came down. He's a veteran. He served he actually served in the same place in Iraq at the same hospital where I served, in a rotation just after me, or maybe one plus after me. And he said, they're not cutting benefits. They're not cutting, the VA is not going to cut your benefits, and the VA is not going to cut healthcare. So that will not be affected. But we know from the 2,400 that were cut, or who were cut right off the bat, that some of those people were researchers, and some of those researchers were conducting important research and they were also treating patients. So we were getting very veteran-centric care. The Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the administration, has said that they are more veteran-centric and that we'll see it to come. But they're not necessarily working with stakeholders like DAV, as we've seen with both parties for a long period of time. DAV, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and VFW, we put out an independent budget every year where we make our recommendations based on our expertise in dealing with veterans every day and providing services to veterans every day. I can just about guarantee that that's not happening. So where are these 83,000 people going to go? How is that going to impact people's processing of claims for benefits? Secretary says it's not, but we really want to just find out where are these people coming from? Are you using veterans preference? Are we cutting out low performers, or is this being done haphazardly? And it seemed, at least with the 2,400, that it was done very hastily with people who did important jobs, and that their jobs could affect the care and quality of life for veterans. So we're all trying to roll with the punches and stay on top of the media cycle and stay on top of the policy cycle, which are two extremely different things. And it's just very hard. We need to work with the administration, whoever they are. But we're in a totally different ballgame right now. So I don't want to be a fear monger. If we cut 83,000 people, if we cut 20,000 veterans potentially, based on 20% of them serving, 20% or more who serve in the federal government are veterans. That's the VA is still there's still hundreds of thousands of employees at the VA. What they're talking about doing there is going back to 2019 levels. And I'm going to talk about this more in the next one. I was involved somewhat in the PACT Act, and we've added 800,000 veterans to the Department of Veterans Affairs since 2019, when President Trump left office. And they account for the increase in employees. We've seen, 800,000 people are now in that system. If we're cutting, where are we making those cuts? It saves taxpayers money, as hard as it is. If it improves outcomes for veterans, we wouldn't be against it necessarily. But it's hard to figure out where they're going to make those cuts, and we need a more transparent federal government right now, for sure.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Karan. Any other questions?
Hey, Dan. Much of this conversation has been related to, obviously, wounds of war and such. But you did allude to the fact, like the Vietnam veteran who lost his leg in a motorcycle accident. And I know myself, having been to many Warriors games, a lot of those athletes participating, well, a number were wounded or injured in combat. A lot of them were in training or in accidents or even off-duty situations. I imagine with those disabled veterans, some might have, a form of imposter syndrome, thinking that, their injuries weren't received in combat. I just wonder, as we're covering communities like that, what are some of the pitfalls that might be there, and how would you approach that, especially with someone whose wounds weren't necessarily from war, but they were from their service?
Thank you, Sam. That's a great question. I'm glad you weren't too mad at my Marines and crayons jokes. I appreciate that. But to get back to it seriously, veterans are very sensitive about that. And just walking up to anyone and just making assumptions, even if they were wearing a veteran, they had a giant veteran or giant Army A on their backpack or something, or the giant Army star on their backpack. Or on the back of their wheelchair or something like that. Making that assumption isn't appropriate. you'd never walk up to someone and start asking them invasive questions about their health when you have a visible injury. That makes it harder. Um, so it's a little bit of a balancing act. My preference is to walk up to someone and talk to them, be very upfront about what you're doing, have a conversation, and ask them if they're comfortable talking about their disability. And that's not inappropriate. That's a more respectful way to do that. But yeah, if you were injured in a car accident, and you were a veteran, and someone else was, and you know that your injury is very visible, and someone just makes the assumption that you're a combat war hero and starts talking to you like that, you feel like by nature of your very being, you're an example of stolen valor. And that's one of the greatest crime. That kind of hypocrisy is the greatest crime to veterans. I think too, just to speak to it, it's very difficult for organizations who work with veterans sometimes to communicate disability, to communicate disabled veteran, because a disabled veteran often looks like any other disabled person or person with disabilities. So it's there are necessities and charities sometimes to communicate very efficiently, and we're very careful about how we present visible injuries. Visible injuries, by the way, do not help with recruiting members to DAV because that's isolating, and that actually prevents some people from seeking our services if they feel that way. That's actually why we use DAV instead of disabled American veterans, because some veterans prefer, like, well, I'm a wounded warrior who receives disability compensation. But that, I think just being sensitive about it and letting the veteran decide what they want to disclose is the way to go. Sam, I'm sorry if I rambled too long. And Karan, I think you have another comment or question.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what you said. A lot of veterans do not seek care because they weren't injured in combat, so they don't think that they've earned it either. And when it comes to especially women and people with invisible disability, it is very sensitive to talk about, but some of us are willing to talk if we're asked. If we're asked. And the assumption, and one of the things that quicks my craw, the assumption that whenever something happens very violent in the country, that the first thing they go to is whether or not they were a veteran. That stereotype, that stigma, it drives me nuts. But many people don't seek care. They don't seek the services like what the DAV offers because they weren't hurt. They weren't physically hurt. And some of what the VA will do is, if you are getting services and you have a developing condition or something that's deteriorating that you may or may not have known about, which is actually what happened to me. I had a deteriorating condition for 10 years before it came to a head. And I wasn't getting VA care because at that time, women didn't have full benefits at the VA. So always going, asking, and also acknowledging the fact that some of our brothers and sisters who've served feel like they don't deserve the support that's there.
Thank you, Karan. I'd like to say, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I'm the spouse of a disabled veteran. My wife was in the Marine Corps. She was a drill instructor. She worked way harder than I did. She's way tougher than I am. She still is. She can still whip me pretty good if she needed to. But, women have at times not considered themselves veterans because they thought that was a boys' club of people who'd been to war only called themselves veterans. When you said the VA was not benefits weren't fully available to women, I've heard of veterans, not just women, all kinds of veterans who say they talked to the wrong person at the VA or something, and they got bad information.
Actually, what I was referring to is women's care, anything that has
women's health care. Absolutely.
Women's health care. We didn't have full health care before President Obama came into office. We didn't have gynecological obstetric care, and we didn't have the benefit of being a military spouse and being able to piggyback on what do you call it? TRICARE, the many transitions of TRICARE. But we, at the VA itself, we had to cover ourselves because we weren't covered.
And that's it's disgraceful. And there was probably a solution at the VA but not enough training. Someone didn't get it. They didn't get the picture. women veterans, you know, if you try and think about it, and men also experience MST, military sexual trauma. But if you're a woman who had been sexually assaulted in the service of your country, and then your command swept it under the rug, what is your likelihood of trusting your government at that point? What's the likelihood that you're going to want to come in and experience the great smell of a freshly waxed government floor, and the advent of women's clinics for veterans? These are things that are saving lives for people, and we've seen women veterans with suicidal ideations, who, when they're welcomed into the veteran community, they become leaders, they become contributors, and that's how we should be treating women veterans. And DEI it's a big concern, especially if it ends up negatively impacting people's health outcomes. That's science. That's not culture war stuff. That's just science and math. I'm a Marine, so forgive me. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Dan. If there's no more questions, I'm just checking LinkedIn to make sure nobody dropped anything over here. But no, I don't know if you can see the chat. There's just been a couple of comments.
Okay.
But no.
Dan Clare is extremely good looking and awesome in every way. Thank you.
Don't read your own comments.
Oh, sorry. Oh, great. National Center on Disability and Journalism has an online style guide. If you use Google, there are a lot of style guides, and that covers LGBTQ, that covers reporting. You know, you can ask those questions, but you know, I struggle still with commit suicide because that's how I've heard that my whole life, and I'm getting remarkably older all the time. So it's something that, you know, we just have to retrain our brains on some of this stuff and retrain our way of thinking. And after you do it for a while, it becomes second nature. But thank you all for your time.
Absolutely, Dan. And we thank you for your time. You all can catch us on another disability narrative webinar next month on, well, I'll share the exact date, but we'll be back next month, and I appreciate everybody joining.
Thank you. Thanks for what you guys do.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
Thanks, Ron.